Imagine a small town in the American Midwest, where winter arrives early and stays longer than anyone expects. Bay City, Michigan, in the late 1950s was a place of wide, quiet streets lined with modest wooden houses, each with a porch light glowing against the deep blue of a December evening. The air smelled of pine and cold iron from the railroad tracks that cut through town. On one of those streets, a little girl named Madonna Louise Ciccone was born into a large Italian-American family. The house on Smith Street was filled with the sounds of children, the clatter of dishes, and an old record player that hummed softly in the living room. Madonna's mother, also named Madonna, had a gentle presence that left a trace of sweetness in every room. She kept a small garden in the backyard, where sunflowers and marigolds tilted toward the Michigan sun in the short, warm months. The little girl would watch her mother kneel in the soil, her hands covered in earth, planting bulbs that would sleep through the bitter winter and bloom again in spring. This image of a woman quietly creating beauty from the ground would echo through the years, long after the garden had disappeared. The house itself was a two-story white frame with a steep roof and a chimney that poured soft gray smoke into the frosty air. Inside, the light was often dim, filtered through lace curtains that caught the afternoon sun like thin sheets of gold. In the living room, a wooden crucifix hung above the mantel, its surface worn smooth by years of touch and prayer. Madonna would sit on the braided rug and stare at the figure of Christ, not with fear, but with a child's curiosity about suffering and quiet endurance. Her grandmother, a devout woman, would light a small candle before the statue of the Virgin Mary each evening, and the wax would drip slowly onto the metal tray, a rhythmic ticking of faith made visible. Those flickering flames in the darkened room planted seeds of ritual and performance that would one day grow into elaborate stage shows, but for now they were simply the silent companions of a girl's bedtime. The neighborhood children played in the snowbanks after school, their laughter muffled by the thick white blanket that covered everything. Madonna sometimes joined them, but more often she would hang back, watching the patterns of frost on the window panes and the way the street lamps cast long, lonely shadows on the pavement. She was learning to observe the world around her with an intensity that set her apart. The sound of a distant train whistle at night was not just noise, it was a call to somewhere else, a promise of motion and unknown cities. She would lie in bed, pull the quilt up to her chin, and imagine the cities waiting beyond the frozen fields. Detroit, Chicago, New York, names she had heard on the radio, spoken like spells. The quilt was heavy, stitched by her grandmother's hands, and it smelled of cedar and dried lavender from the summer garden. These small sensory details became the bedrock of a creative mind that would one day weave them into songs about longing and escape. The family attended St. Joseph's Church every Sunday, a red brick building with a tall steeple that seemed to hold up the gray winter sky. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of incense and old wood. Sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, painting the pews in sapphire and ruby. Little Madonna watched the women in their dark veils and the men in their heavy coats, all moving in a slow, reverent dance of kneeling and rising. The ritual fascinated her, not the doctrine, but the theater of it, the way light and sound and gesture combined to create an experience that lifted people out of their ordinary lives. She would later say that a Catholic Mass was her first lesson in the power of performance. After the service, the family would walk home through the slush-covered streets, the bells still echoing in the cold air. At dinner, pasta steamed in large bowls, and voices overlapped in lively Italian cadences that filled the kitchen with warmth. This was the rhythm of her childhood: silence and snow, candles and garden soil, train whistles and the smell of basil. When Madonna was 5 years old, her mother grew ill. The change came not with loud alarms, but with a quiet withdrawal. The garden was tended less, the voice that sang Italian lullabies grew faint, and the house on Smith Street seemed to hold its breath. One afternoon in December, the light through the lace curtains turned a pale, watery white, and the world outside grew absolutely still. Her mother passed away on the first day of December, leaving a silence that no amount of family noise could fill. The little girl did not understand the permanence of it, only that the garden would be covered in snow for a very long time. This loss, though painful, did not appear as a dramatic wound in her story. Rather, it became a subterranean river that fed everything she would create, a search for warmth, for attention, for a voice that could reach beyond the silence. Years later, she would plant her own gardens, lighting them with candles and surrounding them with music, always trying to recreate that lost world of color and scent. In the years that followed, Madonna's father, Silvio, worked long hours at the automotive factory to support the family, and the children learned to care for one another. The house remained filled with the rhythms of an Italian kitchen, the rolling of dough, the bubbling of tomato sauce, the sharp smell of garlic sizzling in olive oil. On Saturday afternoons, the radio played big band music and early rock and roll, and Madonna would dance barefoot on the linoleum floor, her small body moving instinctively to the beat. She would close her eyes and pretend the kitchen was a grand stage, the reflection in the oven door her only audience. Those moments, unobserved and unrecorded, contained the essence of what was to come, a girl finding freedom in movement, turning the mundane into something sacred. The Michigan winters continued to come, year after year, covering the town in silent white. But inside the house on Smith Street, a spark had been lit, and it would not be extinguished. The bus pulled away from the station in Michigan, just as the first light of a late summer dawn touched the cornfields. In her seat, a 19-year-old Madonna pressed her forehead to the cool glass and watched the flat, familiar landscape recede. She carried only a small suitcase and a winter coat, but inside her was a cargo of restless ambition and a handful of dance steps learned on the kitchen floor. The Greyhound rumbled through Ohio and Pennsylvania, past sleeping towns where porch lights still glowed, past factories that exhaled steam into the pink morning sky. She would later recall this journey not as a dramatic escape, but as a quiet unfolding, mile after mile of still fields and distant silos, a country sliding past in a gentle, hypnotic rhythm. The other passengers dozed or read newspapers. She simply watched the day change shape outside the window, feeling that each mile brought her closer to the person she was meant to become. There was no fear, only a steady, calm expectation, like the pause before a dancer's first leap. New York City in 1978 was a landscape of textures and shadows that changed with every block. She arrived with $35 and the address of a family friend, stepping out of the Port Authority bus terminal into a canyon of buildings that seemed to touch the gray October sky. The air was thick with the smell of roasted nuts from street carts, car exhaust, and the dampness of a city preparing for rain. She walked up 8th Avenue, past stores with faded awnings, past fire escapes that zigzagged up brick facades like iron lace. The noise was constant, the rumble of subway trains beneath the pavement, the blare of taxi horns, snatches of conversation in a dozen languages, but to her ears it was not chaos, it was a symphony of possibility. She found her way to the home of the family friend, a walk-up on the Lower East Side with a creaking staircase and walls that smelled of old paint and incense. That first night, she slept on a fold-out couch near a window that overlooked a narrow alley, and the city lights flickered on the ceiling like a constellation of fallen stars. The apartment was small and crowded with the belongings of several roommates, but Madonna claimed a corner for herself. She hung a few clothes on a metal rack and placed her dance shoes together beneath it, as if they were an altar to a future she had not yet met. In the mornings, she would walk to the Alvin Ailey American Dance Theater, where she had won a scholarship, her footsteps keeping time with the rhythm of the city awakening. The studios were vast rooms with springy wooden floors, tall mirrors, and barred windows that let in a soft northern light. She would spend hours at the bar, moving through plies and tennis, her reflection multiplied infinitely in the mirrors around her. The other dancers came and went, but she often stayed late, when the building grew quiet and the only sound was the hum of the heating system and the distant wail of a police siren. In those empty hours, the studio became a kind of cathedral of the body, and she was learning to turn discipline into grace. Between classes, she explored the city on foot, learning its geography through hunger and curiosity. She would walk through Washington Square Park, where the arch stood white against the autumn sky and leaves skittered along the pathways. Jazz musicians played on the benches, their notes curling upward like smoke, and old men played chess at concrete tables. She passed the brownstones of Greenwich Village with their ivy-covered fronts and flower boxes still blooming in October. On St. Mark's Place, record shops spilled music onto the sidewalk, and she would stand listening to the new sounds, punk, disco, new wave, that were redefining the city's nightlife. She had not yet entered that world, but she absorbed it through her skin, the way she had once absorbed the candlelight and garden smells of Bay City. Every storefront window reflected a different version of herself, a dancer, a student, a woman alone in a huge city, completely unknown and therefore completely free. In the evenings, she often sat on the tar-covered rooftop of her building, a place she could reach by climbing a rusty ladder and pushing open a heavy door. From there, the city spread out in all directions, a sea of water towers, lit windows, and flickering neon signs. The Empire State Building glowed in the distance, changing colors with the season. She would bring a cup of tea and a blanket and sit on an old wooden crate, watching the sunset turn the brick walls from red to orange to a soft lavender. Up there, the noise of the street softened to a low murmur, and she could hear her own thoughts clearly. It was on that rooftop that she began to stitch together the fragments of her old life, the garden, the church, the train whistles, with the possibilities of this new one. She imagined songs she might write, stages she might command, but the imaginings were not frantic, they were calm, almost prayerful, like the litany of a rosary. The years of 1978 and 1979 passed in a rhythm of dance classes, part-time jobs, and a slow immersion into the city's artistic underground. She worked as a hat-check girl at a nightclub, posing for art students at the new school, waiting tables at a diner where the coffee was strong and the jukebox played Patti Smith and Marvin Gaye. Through these fragmented days, she began to meet musicians and painters, people who gathered in loft apartments in Soho with high ceilings and dusty floors, where the light fell in great white sheets. These lofts were unconverted factory spaces, with cast-iron columns and enormous windows that looked out onto cobblestone streets. Someone would put a record on a turntable, and the room would fill with a bass line that vibrated in the chest. In those rooms, Madonna began to understand that dance was not separate from music, that a body moving through space could become the music itself. She started experimenting with her own voice, humming melodies she had carried since childhood, and friends encouraged her to sing. One evening, in a tiny rehearsal room lit by a single bare bulb, she picked up a microphone for the first time not to speak, but to sing a few lines. Her voice was not polished, but it had a clarity, an urgency that made the few people in the room go still. The sound of that voice echoed off the plaster walls, mingling with the faint street noise filtering through the window. Outside, the city continued its relentless hum, indifferent to the small miracle happening in that nondescript room. But for a few moments, time seemed to slow. The girl from Michigan, who had once danced barefoot on a linoleum kitchen floor, had found a new way to fill the silence. The city, which had so many voices, had made room for one more. And this voice, though quiet then, carried something ancient and insistent, the memory of a garden, the flicker of a candle, the rhythm of a train on its way to somewhere unknown. By the early 1980s, Madonna had found her way into the small, smoky clubs of downtown Manhattan, places where the walls were painted black and the air pulsed with drum machines. The Danceteria stood on West 37th Street, a multi-level haven for people who lived by night and slept through the morning sun. Its staircases led to rooms filled with labyrinthine corridors of sound, each floor a different genre, a different tribe. Madonna danced there not as a spectator, but as a force of nature, her movements drawing the attention of people who mattered in the burgeoning dance-pop scene. She was not loud, she was magnetic. On the dance floor, under the shifting lights that painted the room in blues and magentas, she discovered the power of presence. The DJs began to notice her, the promoters, and eventually a young record producer named Mark Kamens. The night he agreed to play her demo tape between sets, The club seemed to hold its breath, and the crowd, glittered, sweating, beautiful, kept dancing. That tape, a simple recording of a song called Everybody, became the spark that lit the fire. The recording studio where they went to cut a proper version of the track was a dark, intimate space in the basement of a building in Chelsea. The walls were covered in foam panels, and a single red light glowed above the mixing console like a tiny beacon. The equipment was old but lovingly maintained, with knobs that had been turned by countless hands, each one chasing a perfect sound. Madonna stood before the microphone, wearing a simple black leotard, her hands resting lightly on the headphones. Through the glass partition, the producer gave her a nod, and the backing track, a shimmering, synth-driven rhythm, filled the room. She closed her eyes and began to sing, her voice raw but sweet, threading through the electronic arrangement like a needle through silk. There was no audience, just the warm hum of the amplifiers, the soft click of the tape machine, and the quiet intensity of a woman doing what she was born to do. The hours passed in a haze of retakes and adjustments, the way a potter works clay, smoothing and shaping until the vessel holds light. During breaks, she would walk outside to the quiet Chelsea street, where the early morning fog rolled in from the Hudson River. The cobblestones glistened under streetlights, and the iron fire escapes on the buildings cast intricate shadows. She often stood near the loading dock, breathing in the cool air and listening to the distant foghorns. These moments of stillness between the bursts of creation were essential to her. They were when the music settled in her bones. She thought of her mother's garden again, the way the flowers closed at night and opened again with the dawn. There was a similar rhythm to making a record, periods of intense focus, followed by a silent waiting, a trust that something beautiful would emerge from the darkness. She would pull her jacket tighter, watch a cat slip through the alley, and then return to the basement, where the red light still glowed, patient and undimmed. The song Everybody found its way from that basement into the hands of Sire Records, and soon Madonna was given the chance to record a full album. The studios grew larger, but their essence remained the same, a control room separated from the live room by thick glass, speakers that filled the space with warmth, and the constant search for the perfect take. For the album that would become her self-titled debut, she worked long nights in a studio on East 49th Street, a room that smelled of leather chair upholstery and stale coffee. The engineer would dim the lights so that only the glow of the view meters and the pale green of the tape machine illuminated her face. She recorded Holiday, a song that felt like bottled sunshine, though it was composed in the dead of a New York winter. The track was built on a simple, bouncing synth line that seemed to smile on its own. When she sang the word holiday, you could hear the yearning for escape, for a day of pure, carefree light, a feeling she had known as a child watching snow fall and dreaming of distant cities. That yearning, transformed into melody, became a gift she would share with millions. During the mixing sessions, she would sit on a sofa in the control room, her legs tucked under her, sipping herbal tea and listening to the playback with a critical ear. She was learning the craft of music production, asking questions about reverb and delay, about how a kick drum could be made to feel like a second heartbeat. The producers and engineers, many of them older men accustomed to doing things their own way, found her curiosity both surprising and admirable. She was not content to be just a voice. She wanted to understand the architecture of sound, the way the cathedral builders understood stone and light. The studio became her classroom, its dim silence her library. In the gentle hum of the equipment, she found a meditation. The album slowly came together, track by track, like a mosaic assembled from broken glass and precious stones. By the time it was finished, the New York winter had given way to a tentative spring. The cherry trees in Central Park were beginning to bloom, and Madonna walked among them on a Sunday morning, knowing that her life was about to change forever. Fame arrived not like a thunderclap, but like a slowly brightening dawn. By 1984, the songs from the debut album had climbed the charts, and Madonna found herself in a world of television studios, photo shoots, and hotel rooms that all looked the same. Yet through it all, she clung to small rituals that kept her grounded. Every morning, no matter which city she woke up in, she would stand by the window and watch the light change for at least 10 minutes. It was a practice she had learned from her dance days, the necessity of stopping, of letting the world wash over you without trying to control it. In hotel rooms in London, the light came gray and soft through tall sash windows. In Los Angeles, it poured in like liquid gold through sheer curtains. In Tokyo, it was silver and precise, etching shadows on paper screens. These quiet dawns, alone with a cup of tea and the sounds of a city waking up, were the secret foundation of her public persona. The transformation from the girl on the rooftop to the woman on the stage was not a sudden metamorphosis, but a gentle, daily unfolding. The Like a Virgin album took shape in these transitional months, recorded partly in New York and partly in Los Angeles. The studio on Sunset Boulevard occupied a converted ballroom with a high, arched ceiling and a stained glass window that someone had salvaged from an old church. During the day, the sun would stream through that window, casting jewel-colored pools of light onto the wooden floor. Madonna would stand in those pools of light as she recorded vocals, her bare feet warmed by the amber and ruby reflections. The song Material Girl was born in that room, but not with the cynical bite that many assumed. When she sang about a world of shiny possessions, she was singing with a dancer's sense of play, dressing up in lyrical costumes the way she had once dressed in her grandmother's lace curtains at home. The recording process was filled with laughter and experimentation. The synthesizers burbled like a fountain, the drum machines clicked with the precision of a clockmaker's dream, and through it all, her voice danced light, flirtatious, but with an undercurrent of knowing. In the moments between sessions, she would wander outside and walk the neighborhood. Los Angeles in the mid-1980s was a city of low, sprawling buildings, palm trees silhouetted against smog-softened sunsets, and a constant scent of jasmine from gardens hidden behind stucco walls. She loved to walk through the gardens of the Greystone Mansion in Beverly Hills, a place open to the public, where terraced lawns descended to fountains and reflecting pools. The mansion itself, a Grand Tudor revival built of limestone, seemed like a relic from another century, its quiet halls holding the echoes of old Hollywood. She would sit on a stone bench and watch the water ripple in the fountain, her mind calm and empty. The architecture spoke to her of permanence and beauty, of the way art could outlast its creators. She began to think of her music not as a product, but as a kind of architecture, songs built to stand the test of time, with foundations of emotion and walls of melody. The music video for Material Girl was shot on a soundstage designed to look like a 1950s Hollywood musical set, all pink satin and crystal chandeliers. The director lit the scene with warm, diffused light that made everything look like a memory of a memory. Madonna wore a strapless pink gown and diamond jewelry that sparkled with each careful movement. But the most striking moments happened between takes, when she would sit on the edge of the set, wrapped in a robe, her face scrubbed clean of makeup, watching the crew adjust lights. The electricians would climb ladders to hang silks over the lamps, softening the glare into a gentle glow. The sound of their footsteps on the metal catwalks was a soft percussion, and the studio fell into a quiet rhythm of preparation. It felt like a church before Mass, that same expectant hush. In those interludes, she was not the Material Girl, she was a woman who had once been a girl in Michigan, remembering the way candle wax dripped onto a metal tray. As the album climbed to the top of the charts worldwide, Madonna retreated whenever possible to a small house she had rented in the hills above Los Angeles. The house had white stucco walls, a red tile roof, and a courtyard with a lemon tree that filled the air with a clean, sharp fragrance. She spent many afternoons in that courtyard, reading books about art history and silent film stars, drawing charcoal sketches of the lemon tree, or simply sitting with her eyes closed, letting the California sun warm her skin. The silence there was a luxury, a fabric she could wrap around herself. She planted herbs in terracotta pots, rosemary, thyme, basil, and watered them each evening as the sun sank into the Pacific. This simple ritual connected her back to her mother's garden, to the soil of Michigan, to the idea that growth happens slowly, underground, in darkness. The public saw only the glittering surface, but the real work, the real transformation, happened in this quiet courtyard, in the space between the lemon tree's shadow and the setting sun. One morning in that house, she woke before dawn and walked barefoot into the courtyard. The sky was still deep indigo, with only a thin line of pale orange on the horizon. The lemon tree was heavy with fruit, each one catching the first hint of light. A hummingbird hovered near the rosemary, its wings a blur of motion too fast to see, and the air was so still that she could hear its soft, mechanical whir. She thought about the word reinvention, which the press would later use to describe her career. But standing there, in the cool morning air, she didn't feel like she was reinventing anything. She felt she was simply peeling away layers, revealing the same core that had always been there: the girl in the garden, the dancer in the studio, the woman on the rooftop. The light grew brighter, and the city below began to stir. Another day of being Madonna was about to begin, but for a few more minutes, she was just a person standing in a garden at peace.